August 1980, a father drove to his daughter's house in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado, knocked on the front door, and received no answer. He knocked again. Silence. He went inside. What he found on the living room floor would remain without justice for 4 decades until a discarded soda can in a Nebraska trash bin cracked open one of the longest-running cold cases in the state's history and delivered an answer that nobody in that quiet suburban community had ever expected. This is the story of Sylvia May Quayle, the woman who loved history and architecture, the woman who lit up every room she entered, and the 40-year pursuit of the man who took her life on a sunny August afternoon while Cherry Hills Village went about its day, completely unaware. Before any of this becomes a story about DNA technology and genetic genealogy and trash cans and courtrooms, it has to be a story about Sylvia. She grew up in the southern suburbs of Denver, graduated from Englewood High School, and went on to work as a secretary at an architecture firm. The job suited her in the way that work only suits people who have found their real passion hiding inside it. Her uncle Wesley Quayle was an architect, and Sylvia spent a significant portion of her free time studying the projects he had left behind, not because anyone asked her to, but because she was genuinely captivated by the discipline. People who knew her remembered her as vibrant, warm, and ambitious. The kind of person whose arrival in a room shifted the atmosphere. She lived alone in a house on South Ogden Street in Cherry Hills Village, one of the most peaceful and prosperous suburbs in the Denver metro area, roughly 7 miles south of downtown. On August 4, 1981, she was 34 years old. That summer morning began without incident. The neighborhood was quiet. The streets were shaded, and still, nothing signaled to anyone nearby that something catastrophic was unfolding inside that house. A man broke in. What followed was not frantic or chaotic. It was deliberate and savage. Sylvia was sexually assaulted, stabbed multiple times, and then shot once in the back of the head. No one heard anything. No one saw anything. The afternoon continued undisturbed until her father arrived, knocked twice, received no response, and walked through the door. He called the police. By the time the sun went down over Cherry Hills Village that evening, investigators were on the scene of what would become one of Colorado's most stubborn cold cases. The early response was serious and thorough. Cherry Hills Village Police coordinated with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to broaden the scope of the inquiry. The crime scene was documented meticulously. Physical evidence was collected and cataloged. DNA samples were taken from multiple locations within the house and from Sylvia's body, clear biological material left behind by whoever had been in that home. The problem was the year in 1981. DNA evidence as a forensic tool did not yet exist in any functional sense. Modern DNA profiling would not emerge until 1984. There was no national database to query. There was no automated matching technology. Investigators could be holding a killer's genetic material in their hands and have no mechanism whatsoever for identifying who it belonged to. They did everything available to them at the time. They questioned men in the surrounding area, pursued leads that surfaced in the weeks after the murder, tracked down individuals with unclear alibis or concerning histories. Each lead was followed. Each lead collapsed. No fingerprints matched any known offender. No witnesses came forward with anything actionable. No charges were filed. The case file remained technically open. But with nothing left to pursue, it drifted into the category that law enforcement calls cold, a file sitting in a drawer, waiting for something the present moment could not provide. Decades passed. The original detectives who had worked the case moved on, transferred, or retired. The 1981 evidence sat in storage. Cherry Hills Village remained quiet and prosperous, its residents largely unaware that the murder on South Ogden Street had never been solved. And the man who had been inside that house on August 4, 1981, continued living his life. By the year 2000, nearly 2 decades after Sylvia's death, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation took a step that technology had finally made possible. The DNA samples collected from the original crime scene were submitted to the FBI's CODIS system, the national database of DNA profiles compiled from convicted offenders across the country. The database ran its search. It returned nothing. The perpetrator was not in the system. He had either never been convicted of an offense requiring DNA submission, or his crimes had occurred before mandatory DNA collection laws were established. The database search, which had represented a genuine moment of hope, produced only silence. The file went back in the drawer, but one person never stopped pulling it out. Sylvia's sister, Joanne Hammett, kept calling the detective division. Year after year, she would contact investigators asking for updates, asking about new developments, asking whether anyone was still working the case. She appeared at the occasional press conferences when the department announced a renewed look at the file. She refused to accept the slow bureaucratic forgetting that claims most cold cases after enough time passes. On Sylvia's grave, the family had chosen to inscribe a particular line, "Beauty seen is never lost." It was how they chose to honor who she had been before that August morning, the woman who was passionate about architecture and history, who filled rooms with warmth when she entered them. But that inscription was also a daily acknowledgement that the man responsible for ending her life was still somewhere out there living freely, unaccountable. 40 years is long enough to watch the people around you gradually move toward acceptance, long enough to hear others suggest, gently, that sometimes these things cannot be resolved. Joanne did not accept that, not because she misunderstood the odds, but because acceptance would have meant surrender. And she would not surrender. She waited for science to catch up with the crime. In 2013, science began catching up. The District Attorney's Office for Colorado's 18th Judicial District established a dedicated cold case unit in 2013, staffed with investigators whose sole assignment was reviewing cases that conventional investigative tools had left behind. Not because new witnesses had appeared or because fresh evidence had surfaced, but because the technology available to analyze old evidence had been transformed. Sylvia Quayle's case was among the first files placed on the unit's table. Investigators pulled the evidence from storage, the DNA samples, the documentation, the interview records, everything collected from that house in 1981, and decided to attempt something that had not existed as an option when the case went cold. They partnered with a private firm called United Data Connect, which specialized in a technique called genetic genealogy, sometimes also described as investigative genetic genealogy or forensic family tree analysis. The approach is fundamentally different from anything CODIS does. CODIS operates by searching a database of convicted offenders. If a perpetrator has never been arrested and entered into that system, CODIS has no knowledge of their existence. Genetic genealogy takes a completely different path. It enters a suspect's DNA profile into public genealogy databases, platforms where millions of ordinary people have voluntarily submitted their own genetic information, seeking to learn about their ancestry, trace family origins, or find relatives. These databases contain no criminal profiles. They contain people who signed up out of curiosity, but if any one of those millions of people shares a biological connection to the individual who left DNA at a crime scene, even a distant cousin 2 or 3 generations removed, even someone who has never heard the suspect's name, the system will detect that shared genetic material. From there, genealogy specialists begin building outward from that connection, constructing a family tree branch by branch, cross-referencing public records including birth certificates, death records, marriage documentation, and census data, narrowing the field until the number of plausible candidates becomes small enough for direct investigation. The DNA from Sylvia Quayle's 1981 crime scene was entered into 2 public genealogy databases. This time, something came back, building the tree. The initial results were not a name, they were fragments. Distant biological connections, relatives 2 or 3 generations away, whose family lines had not yet been connected to a specific individual. The researchers at United Data Connect began constructing the tree from those fragments, tracing each branch with the patience of people who understood that this kind of work cannot be rushed. Public records became the scaffolding. Every birth certificate that could be located, every marriage record, every obituary, every document that a life leaves embedded in official systems over the course of its existence. The tree grew slowly outward and then began to narrow. After months of analysis and cross-referencing, the accumulated work produced a name: David Dwayne Anderson, 62 years old, living in Nebraska, not a local, not someone who had appeared in any of the original 1981 interviews, not a name that existed anywhere in the original case file. A man living a quiet, unremarkable life in a different state entirely. But United Data Connect's documentation went further than just identifying a name. The records they had assembled also established that Anderson had been at locations in Colorado, in the vicinity of Cherry Hills Village, both before and after August 4, 1981. He had been there. The genetic connection placed him in the family tree of the person who had left DNA in that house. And he had been geographically present. None of that was sufficient for an arrest. Genetic genealogy identifies possibilities, not certainties. To obtain a warrant, investigators needed direct biological material from Anderson himself to compare against the 1981 samples. And they needed to collect it without alerting him. Investigators traveled to Nebraska. They located the apartment building where Anderson was living, and they did not knock on the door. They watched. They waited, and when Anderson discarded his trash, they moved to the receptacle after he had walked away and searched through what he had thrown out. Inside the bag, they found an empty can of vanilla Coca-Cola. He had finished and discarded. DNA was extracted from that can. The samples were sent to the laboratory. When the results came back, they matched multiple points of correspondence with the biological material collected from Sylvia Quayle's body and from her home in Colorado 40 years earlier. 40 years of living freely. An ordinary afternoon of finishing a soda. A trash can in Nebraska. An arrest warrant was issued immediately. On February 10, 2021, David Dwayne Anderson was taken into custody in Nebraska. He was extradited to Colorado to face 2 counts of first-degree murder. When the arrest became public, Cherry Hills Village absorbed the news with a particular kind of shock. Not simply because a decades-old case had produced an arrest, but because the person arrested was a complete unknown. No one in the community recognized the name. No one had any connection to him. He was a stranger from another state. someone who had passed through that suburb on a summer day in 1981 and left a crime that would take the better part of half a century to trace back to him. The investigation into Anderson's background did not reveal a person whose neighbors or acquaintances had ever suspected anything alarming. He had existed without special notice, an ordinary presence in the communities where he had lived. Deputy District Attorney Grant Grabow later described the crime itself as brutal and random language, suggesting an opportunistic act with no prior relationship between Anderson and Sylvia, no personal connection, no specific grievance. Just a man, a house, and an afternoon that changed everything for a family and a community that would spend the next 4 decades waiting for an answer. The first trial began in March 2022 at Arapahoe County Court. Jurors heard the complete chain of evidence, the original 1981 material, the genetic genealogy analysis, the construction of the family tree, the Nebraska surveillance, the soda can, the laboratory results confirming the match. They deliberated for 5 days. They could not reach a verdict. The jury was deadlocked. The judge declared a mistrial. For Joanne Hammett, for everyone who had waited 4 decades and believed the hardest part of the journey was finally behind them, this was an almost unbearable development. But the district attorney's office did not withdraw. They refiled charges the following month and prepared to begin the entire process again. In June 2022, a second jury was seated in an Arapahoe County courtroom. They heard the same evidence. They deliberated. They returned a guilty verdict on both counts of first-degree murder. Deputy District Attorney Grant Grabow stood outside the courthouse and addressed the press directly. For more than 40 years, he said, the defendant had carried a dark secret. That secret had been exposed in this trial. Sentencing was scheduled for August 4, 2022. The date was not a coincidence. 41 years to the day from the afternoon, Sylvia's father had walked into that house on South Ogden Street and found his daughter on the living room floor. David Dwayne Anderson stood before a judge and received his sentence. Life in prison because the prosecution had proceeded under the criminal statutes in effect in 1981, the law as it existed at the time of the crime. Anderson was eligible for parole consideration after serving 20 years. That was the maximum exposure permitted under the law that governed the case. It was the framework the law required. Joanne Hammett, who had called detective divisions for decades, who had appeared at press conferences when there was nothing to announce, who had refused for 40 years to allow her sister's name to become another forgotten entry in a cold case archive, stood in that courtroom and said what she needed to say. He needs to pay for what he did, and he had. The neighborhood still looks much as it did in 1981, the tree-lined streets, the well-maintained homes, the quiet that has always characterized this suburb south of Denver. The house on South Ogden Street still stands, but the woman who lived there, the secretary who spent her evenings studying architectural projects, who walked into rooms and changed their atmosphere, has been gone for more than 4 decades. On her gravestone, the words remain, "Beauty seen is never lost." That inscription contains something that extends beyond grief. It contains a refusal to let what happened on August 4, 1981 become the final statement about who Sylvia May Quayle was. She was 34 years old. She had her uncle's blueprints and her own ambitions and her warmth that people still remembered when asked about her decades later. The technology that solved her case did not exist when she was killed. The database that identified her killer's distant relatives was built by millions of people who had no idea their ancestry searches might one day close an investigation from 1981. A man living in Nebraska had no reason to believe that an empty soda can in his own trash bin would end his freedom. And a sister who refused to stop calling, year after year, decade after decade, kept a name on the radar of a system that is very good at losing names. The Sylvia Quayle case leaves behind several lessons worth carrying forward. The first is that physical security matters regardless of where you live. Cherry Hills Village in 1981 was among the safest communities in the state. Affluent, quiet, and low crime were the words people used to describe it. None of those words made Sylvia's home impenetrable. Basic security habits, locked doors, visible deterrence, awareness of surroundings provide meaningful protection even in places where crime feels distant. The second lesson is about persistence, and it belongs specifically to families of victims in unsolved cases. Joanne Hammett's 4 decades of phone calls and press conference appearances were not symbolic gestures. They were functional. They kept a case file from being permanently shelved. They ensured that when the cold case unit was established in 2013, investigators knew which files deserved priority attention. The district attorney's office did not rediscover Sylvia's case in a dusty archive. A family had made sure the case never fully disappeared. The third is about the pace of forensic science. Genetic genealogy did not exist as a usable investigative tool until recently. Cases that generated DNA evidence decades ago but could not produce an identification at the time are now candidates for exactly this kind of reanalysis. If you have information about an unsolved case, even a detail that seems minor, even something you were never asked about, the relevant law enforcement agency should hear it. The information that completes an investigation is often the piece that no one thought to collect. And the last lesson is the simplest. Say the names of the people these cases are about, not the technology, not the legal procedural history. The people, Sylvia May Quayle, was a real woman with a real life, a passion for architecture, and a warmth that everyone who knew her remembered the same way. Community memory, the refusal to allow a name to become just a file number, is part of what keeps justice from being abandoned. If this story reached you, consider subscribing. Every case behind these stories belongs to a person who deserves to be remembered by more than the circumstances of their death. Thank you for watching to the end. We will continue these stories as long as they need to be told.